Today I'd like to continue our discussion of the very first Thanksgiving. We left off last time with Os McQuinn, often referred to as Masvat, the great sachem, kind of making that decision, should I approach the settlers, those who came from the Mayflower? Difficult decision. He decided that he would, so he did reach out to them. They had a very difficult first winter. Half of them did not survive, partly because of starvation, partly because of the cold. So he reached out to them, he made contact with them, and basically his rationale was, I need their assistance to help my people survive in these circumstances that he was in. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims had their first harvest of crops. And basically, they had that first harvest thanks to the Wampanoags teaching them how to plant beans, to plant squash. And they would plant it in a mound with maize all around that mound. And they would use fish. The fish remains as fertilizer, and that fertilizer helped everything to grow. So because of their use of the Wampanoags technique in terms of growing, they had a very bountiful harvest, a wonderful harvest, and they wanted to celebrate that harvest and have a feast. So this harvest feast that they had to really celebrate this wonderful bounty that they had received from the land, this became the basis for our Thanksgiving. Basically, our way of giving thanks to God, our way of feasting and saying, God, thanks for the bounty that you have provided for us. The Wampanoags, however, were not invited to that feast. It was just the settlers, the Puritans themselves, who were at the feast. Os McQuinn and his men showed up only after the English shot off some of their muskets. They were celebrating, they were having a good time, and they shoot off these muskets. And at the sound of the gunfire, the Wampanoags came running, fearing that there was going to be a battle, there was going to be a war, there was going to be some fight, all of these gunshots going off. They were like, what's happening here? 100 warriors came armed, thinking that, this is now going to be a battle. We better be armed. We better be ready for this. When they got there and they were told it was a harvest feast, the Wampanoags joined in to the feast. And they brought live 5 deer to share at the feast. They brought fowl, fish, eel, shellfish, possibly cranberries from some of the cranberry bogs that were nearby. So they brought all this to the feast to enrich the feast, but of course not invited. They just kind of showed up because of the gunshots going off. The Wampanoags did not wear headdresses. Men wore a mohawk roach made from porcupine hair, and it was strapped to their heads. So we see the headdress, the feathers, not really accurate in terms of what they would have worn. For the Wampanoags, what is Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving actually kicked off colonization. It brought 2 things. It brought disease, and it brought servitude. Gives the impression that, a lot of times, this was helpful to the Wampanoags, that the Pilgrims brought them a better life because they were kind of superior. They had more intelligence. They were far superior, which, of course, doesn't turn out to be accurate because who helped them to survive and to plant and to have this harvest was, of course, the Wampanoags. The 1789 Massachusetts law made it illegal and punishable by death to teach a Mashpee Wampanoag Indian to read or write. So were they superior initially? Probably not, but when you make a law saying, you can't teach these people to read and write, you might say they are going to fall behind a little bit, right? The English pushed the Wampanoags off their land, and they forced many to convert to Christianity. It was one of those things where you either pray or you die. So what's the choice there? You know, you can become a Christian, you can follow us, or, you know, death. Wampanoag land, which had been held in common, was eventually divided up. Each family got 60 acres. A system of taxation was put into place. And this was antithetical to Wampanoag culture. They just did not operate that way, of this type of division and this type of taxation. This was not their system. So a system was forced on them, which was not natural to them, which was not really part of their experience. Much later, their children were sent to harsh Indian boarding schools. They were told to cut their long hair, to abandon their Indian ways, and stop speaking their native language. So these boarding schools represented really a destruction of the Wampanoag way of life. Example is the Carlisle Indian School. It was the first government-run boarding school for Native American children in 1879. It was founded by Army Lieutenant Colonel Richard Henry Pratt, and the motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. So the idea was take everything we can out of the Indian in terms of their culture, language, customs, all of that stuff, and we will form a new man, a man that we can mold in our own way, our own fashion, and this will be, you know, this transformation will happen. But what are you doing? You know, you're destroying a whole way of life. So the National Day of Mourning for the Wampanoags in 1970 was started by Frank James after planners for the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower landing refused to let him debunk the myths of the holiday. So he said, you know, hey, you've had this myth for so long, let's tell the truth. Let's tell exactly what happened. Initially, they said, no, we're not going to go that route. We want to keep this wonderful myth kind of going. It's not true, but, you know, let's keep it going. And so Frank James said, no, I'm not going to go along with that. Instead, for him and for the Wampanoags, this became a day of mourning, not a day of celebration. 50 years after that first feast in 1621, the Wampanoags would no longer be a free people. So 50 years later, their freedom taken away. In the 1970s, the Mashpee Wampanoags sued to reclaim some of their ancestral homeland. They lost that suit, in part because a federal judge said that they weren't officially recognized as a tribe. You know, you have to go through this process of becoming officially recognized as a tribe. I mean, you've been a tribe for 10,000 years, but you got to follow our way of being officially recognized. So the Mashpee Wampanoags filed for federal recognition. They said, okay, we'll go through this procedure in the mid-70s. In 2007, they were finally granted that status. A status, of course, that they in fact had for many, many years. The Gayhead Aquanaut and Martha's Vineyard went through a similar process, and they were also federally recognized. In 2015, about 300 acres were put in federal trust for the Mashpee Wampanoags. And unfortunately, this federal trust was dozens of parcels scattered throughout Cape Cod, represents half of 1% of their historical land. The Trump administration tried to take the land out of the trust, still being decided now, this issue by the Department of the Interior. They're hoping for maybe some potential casino development to bring in some funds. And of course, they ran into many problems with development, the pandemic, high rate of diabetes among the people, high blood pressure, health problems, cancers, suicide, opioid abuse. And it's very difficult for them to survive because of the affordability question. Housing affordability in the Cape Cod area is not great. You know, it's a lot of vacation homes, a lot of wealthier people, and so affordability becomes an issue. Also an issue is overdevelopment, pollution, you know, all of these issues. Well, what is for the tribe? For the tribe, the first issue is the land. How can we preserve the land? How can we keep the land pure? All of this development, if it's going to harm the land, not good. 5 years ago, the tribe started a school. It's about 24 children in the school, aged 2 to 9, and they used their native Algonquin language in the school. So again, a good development, a healthy development, right? They're using their own language. Their comment when they reflect on this is, history has not been kind to our people, but we have persevered. I think it's helpful for us to reflect on that very first Thanksgiving, to reflect on what happened to the Wampanoags, and to ask ourselves some questions. You know, was this a good thing that happened? We can't change history. History has not been kind, obviously, to the Wampanoags. You know, and we can't go back and unmake all of that, obviously, but to be aware of it, to reflect on it, and to cherish these people who were here, who helped the initial settlers, helped them survive. Imagine if they didn't teach them some of these techniques, would you know, half of them died the first winter, with the other half have died the second winter, you know. So, you know, when we think about it, we think of the exploitation of people, of taking away their freedom, their land, trying to take away their customs, their cultures, all of that. And we have to reflect and say, well, what can we do now? How can we help these people thrive as we should?